Good morning. So we are looking at, I'm sorry, I don't have the English copy, but you can follow in the Hebrew if you'd like. Okay. We're looking at chapter 475, Taf Ayin Hey, Yad Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Halacha Gimel, Halacha 3. So to get an idea of what we're doing here, so the last piece of Gemara we learned covered three halachas, the chareses. We learned that in the Shulchan Aruch, the making of chareses, and when you eat chareses. The other halacha that we discussed in our Gemara is the moving the plate / table away, which we spoke about the last few days. We looked at that from the Rebbe's Haggadah, from the Alter Shulchan Aruch, and the various different customs about that. We spoke about that. And then the third item, which actually was the first in the Gemara itself, or the second, is the idea that you have to have broken matzah. And you should have a broken, the matzah should be broken, and that's because it has to be poor man's bread, right?
You keep that.
Separate discussion. The second half of the broken matzah goes to afikomen. That's true, but there's a main thing is to have a broken matzah. It's the custom to take the other broken half and have it for afikomen, as we'll learn. But the main thing is to have a broken matzah. When you fulfill the mitzvah to have a broken matzah, because that's a poor man's bread, and a poor man eats only broken bread, not the whole bread. That's the basic Gemara, which we learned. Now, we also learned. So now, when it comes to this broken matzah, just like when it comes to charoises, there are two parts in the Shulchan Aruch. There's the part which describes making of the charoises, which is the beginning of the Seder, and then there's the part of the Shulchan Aruch that describes eating the charoises. That's at Moror, right? So likewise with the broken matzah, there's the part of the Shulchan Aruch which describes the breaking of the matzah, the beginning of the Seder, and then there's the part of the Shulchan Aruch that describes eating the broken matzah, which is later in the Seder when you're eating matzah. So in the order of the Shulchan Aruch, it's chapter 473, which describes the order of the Seder from the first cup to the second cup, which will include the making of the charoises. We covered that. And we'll discuss the moving the table away, which we discussed that. And we'll include the breaking of the matzah. That's between the first and second cup. Chapter 474 discusses the dispute as to whether or not you should be making a bracha, a gofen on each of the four cups. We discussed that a while back. And then 475 takes us from the end of after the second cup, which is when you wash your hands, rachza, to the end of the Seder. So that's going to have the eating of the charoises, which we covered, the eating of kairach, which we also covered, and now we're going to get to the eating of matzah, because the eating of matzah is linked to the fact that there's a broken matzah. So to explain what I mean when I say this, right? Remember the Gemara told us there are three translations to the word poor man's bread. Lechem oini, three translations, right? The verse describes matzah as lechem oini. With me? That's how the verse describes matzah. Gemara gave us three translations to the word oini. Recitation is translation number 1, meaning you recite the Haggadah in the presence of the matzah. Translation number 2, poor man's bread, therefore broken. Translation number 3, poor man's bread, made in haste. Right? Okay. So each of these three translations are halachic in nature. The matzah has to be made in haste. Poor man's bread, easy. The matzah's got to be present when you recite the Haggadah. Matzah of recitation, lechem oini. And then poor man's bread has got to be broken. Okay, that's clear. Now, questions like this. And we're going to get into this over here. And you'll already have a little bit of an answer ready if you remember what we learned a couple of days ago, last week. The translation which says that you have to recite the matzah, you have to recite over the matzah, is that independent of the translation which says that it's poor man's bread? Or are they intertwined? Meaning like this. When it says to recite the Haggadah over the matzah, what kind of matzah do you have to have present when you recite the Haggadah? Any matzah? Or does it have to be the kind of matzah which followed the other translation of lechem oini, which is poor man's bread? Namely, you have to have broken matzah when you recite the Haggadah. So that's the Alter Rebbe learned that when it says you have to have poor man, you have to recite the Haggadah over matzah, you have to recite the Haggadah over the kind of matzah which you would eat when you fulfill your obligation. And what kind of matzah would you be eating when you fulfill your obligation? The other translation of lechem moini, broken matzah. And therefore, you have to have broken matzah when you recite the Haggadah. Thus, yachatz comes before magid. Other opinions which say no. You have to recite the Haggadah in the presence of matzah. Good, so have matzah there. As far as broken, that's only a question of when you eat the matzah, it's got to be broken. And therefore, when would you do yachatz? Not before magid, but after magid, before matzah. And that's indeed Rambam's view. 2 days ago, three chapters a day, Rambam. That when you break the matzah, not like we do before the magid, so that when you recite the Haggadah, you have a broken matzah in front of you. That's not relevant. As long as you have any matzah in front of you, it's good enough when you recite the Haggadah. Breaking of the matzah is only when you eat it.
You have to break it to eat it.
No, in theory, you could bite right out of a whole matzah. Okay, but the question is, do you have to crack it in half before you bite? Yeah, Rambam would say yes, because you have to have broken matzah. But you don't have to have broken matzah when you recite the Haggadah. Whereas Alter Rebbe learned no. When it says that you have to have matzah in front of you as you recite the Haggadah, you have to have the kind of matzah that you will fulfill your obligation with, which is a broken matzah. And if we have to have broken matzah before magid, and therefore yachas becomes before magid, that's our view. So now let's see.
That's why you break it before
magid. Right. The main halachic reason why you break it before magid is that you have that kind of matzah when you recite the Haggadah. Without the Rebbe phrase, it's actually a chiddush. This formulation is a unique formulation of the Alter Rebbe. Although others follow the same opinion that you have to have the broken matzah as you recite the Haggadah, but this formulation that you have to have the kind of matzah over which you would fulfill your obligation when you recite the Haggadah, i.e. broken, that formulation is unique to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, or originated in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, even though the halacha, in broadly speaking, is not unique to Alter Rebbe. Many opinions like that. Yes.
Broken matzah, it doesn't show that the sea was split. This is
No, not that I'm aware of. Maybe, not that I'm aware of. Okay, so the broken matzah is poor man's bread. Maybe it could be it's written somewhere, I don't know. All right, halacha gimel. So now with that background, let's read now the description of eating matzah. Yeah, because it's going to be connected to this requirement that the eating of matzah be a broken matzah, poor man's bread. And it's also connected to something we learned in our Gemara, that you have to have lechem mishneh. Like every Shabbos, you have to have 2 whole breads. In this case, it's 2 whole matzahs. You also have to, as the halacha requires, when you make a bracha ha-moitzi, to make ha-moitzi on, if you can at least, on a whole loaf, rather than a broken piece, which in this case would be a whole matzah, rather than a broken one. And yet you also have to satisfy the halacha which says you have to have a broken matzah because that's poor man's bread. So how do you do all these different requirements? That's what we're going to be learning now in the different opinions as to when the matzah has to be broken. And that will change. Do you have to have 2 matzahs at your seder or 3? So this is where we're going. Let's learn. Can we clear all this?
Yeah.
Okay, Gimel. Even though it's true that every Yom Tov, chayav adam liftzaya, person is required to partake of LECHEM MISHNE on 2 loaves, as shall be explained in chapter 529 in the halachas of Yom Tov, where there it's going to explain that you have to have 2 loaves of bread. Yeah. It's a long footnote there, but we're going to leave it alone. Nevertheless, the Leil Pesach, on the night of the Seder, there are those who are of the view, Rambam and others, you don't have to have 2 loaves, you only have to have 1.5 loaves, meaning a whole matzah. Loaf here means a matzah, right? Let's remember that our matzah is thin and flat and completely doesn't look like anything like a loaf. But in theory, your matzah could be a full loaf, as long as it didn't hit the requisite amount of time of being left alone for it to be halachically considered chametz. Right? We are extremely stringent with our matzah making, and we make sure it's all cooked within 18 minutes and it's all flat and baked to the core. But it doesn't have to be that way. And it seems like in the old days it wasn't that way. People used to make matzah on Pesach, as long as they were kneading it the whole time, and they didn't leave it alone for, let's say, 18 minutes. It could be a different number, but let's say 18 minutes. They didn't leave it alone unkneaded. As long as they didn't do that, it's matzah. In fact, from Rambam a few days ago, he described matzah that could be even stringy. But he said, make sure that don't do that when you're fulfilling your obligation, for whatever reason. But the point is, it's not necessarily like flat, crispy crackers like we have. That's what we have, but it doesn't have to be that way. At least it's a bare minimum halacha. So loaf means here a matzah.
Kind of like like you mentioned, the bread, the bread in the Beit HaMikdash.
That's right.
12 loaves.
Most of the bread in the Beit HaMikdash were matzah,
Was
but it had to be a tefach.
Yeah.
Lechem.
Yeah.
Actually, I just recently listened to a podcast with a fellow who published a book on that Lechem Mishnah, on the showbread, whole book. He's an artisan baker, and he goes through the process of how he figured out how to make a non-chametz bread that's actually a full tefach thick in the shape of what. He wrote a whole book on Lechem Mishnah.
Apparently that shape.
Very fascinating,
is a
actually.
secret on his family.
So he gets into all that. He gets
Oh,
into the
really?
whole thing. Yes, very fascinating. I actually want to buy the book. The book is Hebrew, but I can send you a link to the podcast if you remind me. A plug, I don't mind. There's a podcast called Sfarim Chatters. It's a Talmud Chacham who basically hosts authors of new Sfarim to review their Sfarim.
Oh, nice.
So every now and again you get like a new sefer, and they're like always these unique kind of not classic books.
Right,
Here's a
right.
baker who's a Talmud Chacham he was into baking, and he wrote a whole book on Lechem Mishnah. Anyway, but the point you're right is that it's a matzah. It's not chametz. It's not allowed to be chametz. Lechem Mishnah, the lechem apanim, the showbread's not allowed to be chametz, and there's a full tefach thick. Had to be. And the same thing with all except for
For a few.
Soita
Shavuos.
and Shavuos. I think those are the only two.
What's the other one?
And Toida, the Thanksgiving offering, the Shavuos one, and the Soita one. No, Soita was barley, but not chametz. Those two were chametz. The Thanksgiving and Shavuos were chametz. Otherwise, all offerings in the temple were matzah, and some of them could be very thick, and some of them were fried or whatever. As long as it didn't sit untouched for the right amount of time for it to become chametz. So the point being is the loaves here don't necessarily mean a loaf of bread. It could be. It doesn't necessarily mean crispy. It just means a whole matzah. That's all it means. Okay. Sidebar. Close parentheses.
I read somewhere that when they left Egypt, their matzah looked like pita roll.
Yeah,
pita
it's
bread.
most likely. Most likely. Yeah, the Yemenites still today have soft matzah specifically. Okay, close parentheses. So, all to say, it's true that every Yom Tov you have to make a bracha on 2 loaves. We call Mokam nonetheless, the third line of Halacha 3. The Leil Pesach, and the night of Pesach. Yesh Oimrim, there are those of the view. Rambam. Shein tzarich ki'im achat matzah. You only need to have 1.5 loaves. 1.5 matzah. Why? Lafi Shema Shadarshu Chachamim, considering the fact that which our sages explained, our Gemara, Mimasha Kosav Lechem Oini, from the fact that our verse describes matzah as Lechem Oini, but describes so Chaser Vav without the Vav, right? The word Oini, the vowel for Oi, could be either a Vav, which would spell the word Aleph Vav Nun Yud, which is usually how you describe the word recitation. Recitation is usually spelled Aleph Vav Nun Yud Nun or Aleph Vav Nun Hey, but here the pasuk writes it without a Vav, giving you just a dot in the top left of the ayin. So if you read it without the vowels, it could be Ani, poor man. And therefore our sages derived, yes, remember this? Shetehei hamatzah prusa kedarka shel ani. That the bread should be broken, or a piece of bread rather than a whole loaf, the same way a poor person only has a piece of bread, not a loaf.
Hence 1.5.
So they say, hence 1.5. Now, what are the sages telling you when they say this? Lord Darshu, what they're telling you is, to tell you, hey, usually you're a rich man on Yom Tov and you have 2 whole loaves. On Pesach, you're a poor man, have 1.5. One shouldn't be whole. So actually, in this opinion, you dafka shouldn't have 2 whole loaves.
Curiosity's sake, no?
Not for curiosity's sake, for a poor man's sake. So when the sages said, hey, tonight have poor man, they're telling you in contrast to what we usually tell you, which is to be rich and have 2 whole loaves. We're telling you today to be poor and make sure one's broken. So in this opinion, how many matchas do you have on your Seder plate?
2. 1.5.
1.5. Don't have 3.
You have to.
Having 3 ruins it. If the sages tell you that you shouldn't have rich man 2 whole loaves. You should have only 1.5. Actually, Dafka should not have a third matzah on your Seder plate. So if you were a pure Rambamist, you'd only have 2 matzahs on your Seder plate. Either to begin with, you only put 1.5, or before you ate, or before you made the bracha, you break it and have 1.5. I believe it's before you make the bracha. Can you pass me the Rambam's manin? The bottom shelf, Rambam's manin?
Instructional to say to break the.
Yes. So if I remember correctly, is manin, you see it? Thank you very much. Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, I'll look it up before I say anything. He says to break the matzah before you make the bracha. Where usually you break it after you make the bracha. Not mistaken?
You have to do it before, because
That's right.
otherwise it wouldn't be a lechem oni.
Yes. Take 2 loaves, break one of them, take the broken piece and stick it inside the whole one. Because that way, when you make the bracha moitzi, what's apparent is the whole one, but you still have the broken one there because it's lechem oni, and then you make a moitzi. So for Rambam, yachatz come right before moitzi. So it would be rachta, yachatz, moitzi matzah.
Wait, do they say inside or inside?
Inside, yes.
And
We can't wrap.
implies that there's 3.
No. Not
Because
between
how can you
2.
Put inside between.
Because
2?
again, our loaves are not hard like our crackers.
It puts it
They could be
inside
soft.
The fold of one.
Yeah. Like imagine taking a lafa. You have a whole lafa, a half a lafa, and you take the whole lafa and wrap it around the whole lafa. Take the whole lafa and wrap it around the half lafa. Imagine you doing that. So it would be, we have yachatz before magid, but Rambam says to do rachza, yachatz, moitzi matzah. Wash your hands, rachza. Yachatz, break the matzah, not break the middle matzah, just break your second matzah, and then make the bracha al moitzi. Does he even say that you have to have the matzah present when you read the Haggadah? I believe the answer is yes. Let me see a second. Yes, the matzah is there when you recite the Haggadah. At least one. Doesn't have to be 2, at least one. It doesn't have to be a broken one. Right? Alter Rebbe said you have to have a broken one present while you recite the Haggadah. Rambam doesn't say that. As long as you're eating, or as long as you're making the bracha on a broken
Because
matzah.
they define lechem oni with a vav and therefore recitation.
They translate all the Lechem Moni translations as independent of each other. Recitation of over matzah, one translation. Recite over matzah.
That's the one where there's
Recitate,
no sign on.
and that's why they have one matzah there. That's right. You have a matzah there to recite. And then separate from that is that you have to have 1.5 breads. One should be broken
That's
because of poor man's bread. That's only when you eat it. Yeah, we clear on this. That's opinion A, Rambam, which of course you all know is not the way we practice. The Yesh Ayim others say this is the common practice. Rashi, Rashbam, and others that when the sages say poor man's bread, they don't mean poor man's bread in replacement of lechem mishnah. That would mean 1.5 breads, like Rambam. Don't have regular lechem mishnah, only have poor man's bread, 1.5. They say no, the broken matzah here is in addition to the lechem mishnah. Meaning, in addition to the 2 whole loaves that you have to have like every Yom Tif, you should have another matzah, which is broken as a result for lechem oni. That's why we have 3 matzahs. Even though we talk about all these symbolisms, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and all these different symbolisms with 3 matzahs, the basic halachic reason for 3 matzahs is because you have to satisfy 2 different halachas. Number 1, you have to satisfy lechem mishnah, which is to have 2 whole loaves. A, B, you have to satisfy the halacha to have a broken matzah. Thus, total 3. Basic halacha.
2 whole and 1 broken.
That's right. Where Rambam says, no. The broken one is actually to replace your lechem mishnah. So only have 1.5. As opposed to which had 2.5. Right? The half being made from the 3. Yeah. This has become the common practice to have 2 whole and 1/2. And one should not deviate from this practice, the universally accepted practice, which is to have 2 whole loaves plus a half, unless you're in extenuating circumstances. As will be explained in chapter 482. Essentially, reading from the footnote, the source describes a situation where a person does not have enough matzahs to have 2 whole matzahs for each of the 2 sidarim, which are conducted outside of Eretz Yisrael. So let's say a guy only has let's imagine a guy only has 3 matzahs and he has 2 seders. What should you do?
First night.
You sure?
Go with the Rambam's opinion.
Go with the Rambam's opinion. 1.5 the first night and 1.5 the second night. So you should follow the halacha, which is the common practice of Rashi, Rashbam, Tosfos, that school of thought, which says to have lechem mishnah plus lechem oni. Lechem mishnah, 2 full matzahs plus poor man's bread, a third matzah, which is half. But in order to do that, you have to have a minimum of 5 matzahs. If you're outside of Israel, 2 whole ones for each night and 1/2 to split between the 2. Right? Imagine you're not actually doing the function of yachatz. You just crack it in half in advance, and you have it there, right? Because our yachatz, again, we're breaking the middle matzah only for the purpose of having a broken matzah when you're inside the Haggadah. Okay, so I don't have to break it at that point. I can break it before I even sit down and just set my Seder plate with 2.5 matzahs to begin with, in theory. So if I had 5 matzahs, that's enough for 2 nights. But if I only had 3 matzahs, guy's living in Russia somewhere, and he only has 3 matzahs available to him, what should you do? Follow Rambam's view and have 1.5 for each night. Because in Rambam's view, that is your lechem mishnah, or it's a replacement of your lechem mishnah. Instead of lechem mishnah, you have 1.5 matzahs, because lechem oni, poor man's bread. In other words, is poor man's bread in addition to lechem mishnah, or is it in replacement of lechem mishnah? Clear? That's machlekes. And the other machlekes is, again, is if you have to have it at the beginning of your seder or only before you eat. That's again another machlekes. Rambam and the other views, whether you do yachatz before magid or yachatz after rachza. Do you break the middle matzah before you recite the Haggadah, so you have the broken matzah there the whole time, or do you break the middle matzah, or you break your second matzah according to Rambam before you make a bracha, just so that you make a bracha on a 1.5 matzah? Okay. Today is Thursday, so only tomorrow we'll continue to talk about how to make the brachas. So you want to make the brachas in such a way where you actually have the lechem mishnah there, but you also have the broken one. So we'll talk about all that, holding the matzah and then dropping the bottom one. And we'll talk a lot. We'll talk all about that as well. Have a wonderful day, Yudin.
Thank you, Rabbi. Sorry I was a few minutes late.
No worries. Have a good day, Judge. Nice to see you.
You gave me a beautiful thought that I'll share with you I'll send you a text.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I wish you all a wonderful day. And I should go off, Rabbi. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Good day,
All the
Jim.
best.